My family has lived in the same house for nearly 50 years. A home that watched my mom grow up, my aunts and uncles come and go, and my cousins and I fill the streets with bikes and games. A home that holds decades of memories, traditions, and a deep sense of comfort. But alongside all of those memories, there has always been one consistent problem on my street: speeding. Because my street sits directly off a busy highway, cars often turn onto it without slowing down, and what should be a quiet residential road often feels like an extension of the highway itself. As I grew up, I became more aware of how dangerous this really was. The simple task of crossing the street, riding a bike, walking a dog, or even backing out your driveway could feel stressful and at times unsafe. What should have felt normal and safe for kids in the neighborhood instead felt like something we had to be cautious about all the time. It was an issue my family and neighbors had discussed for years and had drafted potential solutions, but never fully solved. So, when I was prompted at the beginning of the year to choose a personal project to focus on, this felt like the perfect choice. It was something I cared deeply about, something I had personal experience with, and something that clearly needed attention. I thought it would be an easy project to commit to because of how much it resonated with me. I imagined myself taking real action, possibly even making a difference not only for my family, but for everyone who lives on my street. However, as the year went on, my expectations and reality began to look very different. In class, I found myself distracted and focused when it came to this project. Ironically, anything else that wasn't my project suddenly seemed more important and more interesting. Homework for other classes, small tasks, even random distractions felt easier to give my attention to. I did some early thinking about what I could do. I considered putting up signs, speaking to neighbors, contacting the town about speed monitoring, or tracking the speed of cars myself. I imagined creating awareness, maybe even starting a small neighborhood effort to push for change. I had ideas, and they felt like good ideas, but they mostly stayed in my head, never turning into action. Realistically, what I did throughout most of this project was think, plan mentally, and postpone. I didn't take action outside of class, and even during class time, I often worked on assignments for other classes instead. This project slowly became something I kept telling myself I would get to later, and the more I delayed it, the harder it felt to start. I became more aware of this when we were asked to reflect on our level of engagement. I confidently placed myself in the avoiding category, and that was the moment I realized how far I had drifted from my original goals. I had to stop and ask myself what had changed. Why was something I cared about so much now something I was avoiding? I realized that in my mind, this class didn't feel as urgent as my other classes. Because it didn't have constant deadlines or immediate consequences, I convinced myself it could wait. But over time, I began to neglect the course without even fully realizing I was doing it. I started prioritizing anything that felt more structured and immediate, even if it wasn't as meaningful to me. Through this, I started to notice a pattern in how I handle long-term responsibilities. I learned that when a project is open-ended and lacks structure, I tend to avoid it instead of managing my time better. I used to tell myself I was just busy, but this project helped me to understand that I was actually choosing to delay something because it felt overwhelming and unclear. I also realized that I rely heavily on feeling motivated before I start something. I would tell myself that I begin when I felt ready or inspired, but that feeling rarely came. I saw this pattern not only in this class, but in my other classes as well. I would wait to start assignments or essays until I felt like my heart was in it. In this project, that moment never seemed to arrive. This made me recognize that I relied too much on my emotions and not enough on discipline. Another major realization was how my own thoughts were holding me back. I was worried about not knowing where to start, doing it incorrectly, or my worst fear, not making a real difference at all. Instead of working through these thoughts, I let them stop me from acting at all. Although I didn't accomplish much in terms of physical progress on this project, I know I learned and improved in a different way. I can now clearly explain what was happening in my mindset throughout this year instead of simply saying that I didn't have enough time or that I forgot. Instead, I understand that my lack of progress was tied to my habits, my mindset, and how I respond to tasks that feel big, unclear, or overwhelming. I also learned that putting something off for a long time actually creates more stress than simply facing it early. The longer I avoided this project, the heavier it felt in my mind. It became something I felt guilty about rather than excited about, and that guilt made me want to avoid it even more, creating a cycle that was hard to break. If I were to redo this project, I would approach it very differently. I would start with one small, manageable step instead of thinking about the entire project at once. For example, simply talking to one neighbor or sending one letter to the town or timing the speed of cars for just 10 minutes. I would push myself to begin even when I don't feel completely ready. I would also accept that making mistakes or doing something imperfectly is far better than avoiding it altogether. Even though this project did not turn out the way I originally imagined, it still taught me something extremely valuable. While I didn't take action on this issue of speeding on my street this year, I gained a much deeper understanding of myself, how I handle responsibility, how I react to long-term projects, and how my mindset can either push me forward or hold me back. This experience showed me that growth doesn't always come from success. Sometimes it comes from recognizing where you fell short and learning from it. The issue I chose is still very real, and I still care deeply about it. Every time I see a car speed past my house, I'm reminded that this problem still exists and still affects people who live here. That is why I continued working on this project more seriously. I have already begun taking the small steps I avoided before. I started by speaking with a few of my neighbors about the issue to see if they shared the same concerns, and many of them did. I began timing and observing how fast cars were actually traveling down the street at different points in the day to gather real information instead of just relying on my memory. I also looked into who to contact at the town about the traffic concerns and began drafting a letter to request speed monitoring or possible signage. These actions may seem small, but for me, they represent a major shift from thinking to doing. Now that I understand what stopped me before, I feel more prepared to approach it differently. I know that the key is not waiting for motivation, but creating action. I know that the key is not having a perfect plan, but simply starting, and I know that the small steps taken consistently can lead to real progress. This project may have not turned into the success story I imagined at the beginning of the year, but it turned into something just as important. It helped me understand myself in a way I hadn't before. And with that understanding, I feel ready to finally turn my thoughts into action and work toward making my street a safer place for the next generation of kids who grow up here.